So welcome to core surgical training in the East Midlands South. I'm Alwyn Abraham. I'm an orthopaedic consultant at the Leicester Royal Infirmary, and I'm also TPD for East Midlands South core surgical training. Thank you very much for choosing to come to the East Midlands. We work as a pair, myself and Mr. Rate. Mr. Rate is a co-TPD, and he manages the education side of the program, and I do most of the admin for the program. Most of your interaction has obviously been with me. I thought I'd just quickly create a video to give you a brief overview of the training program, and also to highlight what you really need to know for the next 2 years that lie ahead. Most of you will have a very clear idea of what's required. You've been FY1s, FY2s, and you've worked up to this juncture of your career. And the other thing is that obviously you've got into the swing of your rotation. Hopefully you've settled in, and you've had a month where you know. You've become familiar with the work that's required of you. For many of you, working at CT will be very similar to the work that you did at FY2. Hopefully, you will get more surgical exposure on the basis that you've been employed as core surgical trainees. So I'm going to just share a PowerPoint with you, and I'll talk through it as we go along. Yeah. Okay, so my top tips for your core training is for you to, number one, prioritize the MRCS. Without the MRCS, your surgical career will stall. It's not impossible to continue with a surgical career. It's not impossible to progress to national selection and ST3 training if you don't get the MRCS within core surgical training. But it makes it more challenging and certainly more stressful and certainly more lengthy. So prioritize the MRCS. Secondly, in order to further your surgical training, make use of the ISCP. It's a syllabus created by a generation of surgical trainers to essentially give you the things that you really need to know, both for core surgery but also for more specialist surgery. Many of you might have family, partners, spouses, friends that you want to continue seeing in the course of your core training. I appreciate it's only 2 years, and so relocation for everyone is not really practical. But the more you commute, the more stressful core training becomes. You're on shifts, most of you. You have weekends to do, you have nights to do. And if you're commuting 4 or 5 hours to see people on the weekend, then the chances are that's going to eat into your study time and your recovery time from nights and weekend work. In order to make yourself competitive at ST3 level, you need to multitask. You need to multitask your study for the MRCS, and you need to also focus on what it will take for you to get an ST3 number. And what will get you an ST3 number is if your CV, if your application is competitive. So start projects early, and don't underestimate how long it takes for projects to come into fruition, so that it's another line on your CV. Find people in your department, in your chosen field, who can guide you, who can mentor you. A a helpful registrar, helpful consultant is invaluable to further your career. And make a decision on what field of surgery you wish to pursue. Most of you have done that. There's a small minority who haven't, and I think that affects your ability to focus your mind on preparing a competitive application for ST3. So make a choice, and make a choice early. I was very fortunate to have a discussion with someone who's finished core training fairly recently. So Chris is now an ST3 in the West Midlands, and he finished his CCT training in 2019. And when I had this discussion very recently with Chris, he said in no uncertain terms that passing the MRCS has to be your top priority. When I look at the cohort that we have now, so we have 18 in CT1 and 18 in CT2, that makes 38 trainees across the 2 years. I can divide the whole 38 into roughly thirds. So there's a third of you who have passed the MRCS. There's a third of you who have passed Part A and are waiting to do Part B. And then there's another third of you who haven't passed either A or B. And as you can imagine, those of you who haven't passed A or B are predominantly in CT1, but there's a few, about 3 or 4 in CT2 who still haven't passed MRCSA. And that is going to be challenging to prepare yourself for the end of core training and transitioning straight into ST3. The chances are that if you're delayed with passing the MRCS, you're likely to have to spend a CT3 year, maybe even a CT4 year, to get the national selection of your choice. Chris also gave a couple of tips about the MRCSB, and as I thought, practicing MRCS type viva in small groups is absolutely crucial. Getting your confidence by saying, conveying your knowledge, practicing that in a viva or in a pair with someone is absolutely crucial to passing the MRCS. There used to be some teaching up in the northern part of the deanery, someone called Catherine Smith, who's the TPD in the north. She does a weekly group grilling for MRCSB, but we've created our own program, and we will run this on Zoom for those who are coming up to MRCSB. So please look out for email alerts inviting you to participate in MRCSB teaching, and I will specifically target those 11 or 12 of you who have yet to pass MRCSB. In terms of preparing yourself for national selection, every bit of what you do must count. Make sure that any project you volunteer for, any teaching session that you volunteer for, make sure in your mind very clearly that this is going to be a line on your CV, and you have to be quite cutthroat about this. Quantity is much more important than quality. If you look at the national selection matrix for most specialties, then you'll find, ironically, that something like a completed audit with completed loop scores just as much as, say, a PhD. So quantity more than quality, and audits and quality improvement projects can go in more than one domain. So for instance, an audit can go into quality improvement domain. Equally, it could go into a managerial domain or a leadership domain. So use your involvement in projects in the department to further your national selection credibility. I can't emphasize how quickly national selection comes up. essentially national selection comes up at the end of your CT1 year. You finish your CT1 year in August, and the following, you start CT2, and within a few months, in November usually of your CT2, the advert for national selection is out. Interviews are usually carried out in the March of CT2, so unless you've got your MRCS by the end of CT1, it becomes very difficult to apply for national selection the following year. And as Chris said in his message to me, you need to be very cutthroat about your application. Make sure that your application is being updated on a weekly basis to show something that reflects your drive to get that number that you want. Chris had a few other tips which I can support. Make yourself visible on social media. It's probably the best way to hear the latest tidbits about what's required. The more visible you are, the chances are the more you will be in tune with changes, new regulations, new ideas, new training tips, etc. I'll just let you read of what Chris said. Feel free to pause the video, by the way, and read in more detail whatever script is on the screen. But Chris had to take a year off between CT2 and SD3. But in the end, it's a common phenomenon. Many people have to do this, especially the ones in the specialties where selection is much more competitive and the numbers are much fewer. You might feel that in many, this is a slide just to cover your current attachment, and you might feel in some instances that CT training, your new CT post, hasn't really changed from what you used to do as FY2, and it really ought to be different. And if it's not different, if you're in a department where core trainees are really treated as FY2s and no different, you really ought to be highlighting that to me. You should get specific core surgery teaching. You should get support to complete audits. You should have access to study leave. There should be engagement with getting your WBAs done, especially the mandatory WBAs. So for instance, closing a wound, prepping a surgical field, draping a surgical field, doing the WHO checklists. All these should be something that your trainers encourage you to participate in. These are the building blocks of getting confidence in the operating theatre, and unless you do that regularly, then the chances are you won't develop into someone who can then actually do the operation and lead the surgical team. Make sure that you spend as much time as you can with consultants, both on ward rounds to pick up tidbits, practice bedside teaching, maybe even do a bedside examination. Make sure that you get into consultant clinics. That's another good way to get good quality teaching relevant to the MRCSB. A few details about the program itself. It's quite a small region. I'm sure there are some training programs up and down the country which are much wider spread of posts. I think the longest commute would be somewhere from Leicester to Northampton, 40 odd miles. Leicester to Kettering is perhaps a bit smaller, 25, 30 miles. So it's a fairly small catchment. It's a fairly small geographical region to commute for. And generally speaking, we have a reasonable teaching program, which we are working hard to improve. This year particularly, we've made a huge effort to make the teaching program much more MRCS friendly, and listen out for the emails that will come your way if you are about to appear for MRCSB. So as you can imagine, most of the jobs are trauma, orthopedics, general surgery themed, and similarly for CT2. This year in CT2, this year in core training, we welcome the first ever batch of IST training. So a couple of trainees who have got run through training numbers from CT1 all the way through into CT3. They still have to do all the assessments. They still have to show that they are eligible for completion of CT2. So it's not as if IST trainees have like a free ticket into ST3. They still need to show that they are competitive and that they would pass the national selection interview into ST3. And we also have our first IST in vascular surgery. So the exam success rate over the last few years, well, it does vary. So you know, some years we seem to have more people passing than others. 2014 it was 94% by the end of CT2. 2015 it was 78. So yes, every year we have a few CT2s who've unfortunately not been able to negotiate the exams and therefore need extra training time to get through training. 2016 it was 81. So you can see roughly, you know, 4/5 of any cohort passed through the training scheme having passed the MRCS. About 50% of our trainees get straight into some kind of ST3 post, where 50% have to spend a bit of time between CT2 and ST3, and this is more likely if you've chosen a subspecialty which is much more competitive, say like plastics or pediatric surgery, where the numbers every year that are taken in are very small. Some information about ARCPs. So I will just summarize what each of these outcomes is on the slides that will follow. But essentially, outcome 1 or outcome 6 are what you're aiming to get. Outcome 1 is the outcome that allows you to move from CT1 to CT2. It means that at CT1 you've got all the things that you need to graduate to your second year of training. Outcome 6 is when you've finished your training, when you move from CT2 to ST3, and it means that after 2 years of training you've reached a desirable standard expected of a new ST3 trainee. So standard outcomes, as I said, outcome 1 and outcome 6. Outcome 1 when you move from CT1 to CT2, and outcome 6 when you've completed core training. Outcome 2 is when you haven't quite got the standard required at the end of CT1, and we might give you some specific targets. So we might highlight that your exam failure is a cause of concern and that you need to give this specific attention. We might also say that your ability to keep a up-to-date portfolio, for instance, is poor and that needs to improve. If you need more time at the end of core training, CT2, you might need extra time. And outcome 3 is much more, the most common reason for getting an outcome 3 is if you haven't passed the MRCS. If you haven't passed the MRCS after the end of CT2, in most instances, we will allow you an extension of 6 or 12 months to get the MRCS if you wish. Outcome 4 is if you get to the end of CT2 and you haven't passed the MRCS. If you haven't got the requisite criteria to finish training, then you'll get an outcome 4, which means that you've not completed core training. If you get an outcome 4, it doesn't mean that you can't get international training. You can, but you will probably have to undertake further core surgical posts between CT2 and then applying again at some stage in the future for national selection. Outcome 5 is if you come to your final ARCP and you haven't got the evidence we want. Perhaps you're not so good at keeping your portfolio, perhaps you haven't had your learning agreement signed off, but all of these could essentially mean that you come to the end of your training. So we give you a month, so an outcome 5 will change to either an outcome 1 or an outcome 6 or an outcome 4 if you haven't kept your portfolio as up to date as we expect. At the end of CT1, we hope that you're well on your underway for transition to a CT2 and for applying for national selection. If you need some extra help, for instance, if you're struggling with the work-life study balance, then we can often give you some support with that. Please do approach me for help if you feel that you're finding the study and the work difficult to juggle. As I said earlier, we want you to be able to transition from CT2 into an ST3. So giving the MRCS your best efforts, making your CV competitive for national selection, is the bare minimum. We do have an education program, and the dates for this will be circulated by Mr. Rate. The teaching is split between Leicester and Nottingham, so it usually alternates. In Nottingham, there is a little bit more a workshop type teaching, whereas in Leicester, it's more classroom type teaching. All of you have signed up for IRCP. I've validated all your placements, and you've all done it in good time, so well done with that. Please keep your IRC portfolios up to date. I can't emphasize enough how important that is to ensuring you finish your training with all the evidence that you need. Make sure that your placements are validated in good time, and the standards expected were circulated to you by email, and they're also contained in the global objectives. Make sure that your learning agreements are completed in time. Before you move on, make sure that people have filled in their clinical and education supervisor reports. It's really difficult to move. It's really difficult to get reports done in retrospect when you've left the department, when you've moved to a different place, maybe even a different town. So make sure that you do these in good time. Your meetings don't have to be face-to-face. I know everything seems to be virtual now, Zoom, Teams meetings, and that's probably made things a lot easier for IRCP. But a lot of IRCP can be just done by email. I'm not expecting every meeting to be face-to-face. As long as your educational supervisor is someone who replies to your emails and gets things done in good time. Please feel free to remind them. And if you're having to remind people more than once or more than twice, feel free to copy me into your emails so I know that you're having particular difficulties getting your IRCP things signed off. So just a final slide, just to emphasize once again, MRCS has to be your key. Pass it as soon as you can. And the 7 or 8 of you in CT1 who are starting without MRCS, make this your absolute priority. And there's no point accumulating all those points on your CV if you're not able to pass your MRCS in the first year. Minimize your commuting. I think if you are trying to juggle work, night shifts, weekend shifts, if you add commuting on, you're going to have even less time to study. So minimize your commuting and your weekend trips away. You need to find a way to study on the job. So make notes, make little PowerPoints, reflect on what you see. If you're on call for general surgery, for instance, there are likely to be cases that will come up in the MRCS. So use these cases, this clinical exposure that you get on a daily basis. Make a viva out of whatever you see on a daily basis, and that's the best way to study for a postgraduate exam such as this. The ICP syllabus is there for to guide you, so make sure that you cover all aspects of the syllabus. I did talk about multitasking exam with preparing your ST3 application. Be ruthless, collect points for your CV from day one. Show enthusiasm, declare your interest in a specialty to consultants, to registrars, so that they can help you, guide you, and include you in projects. I thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's been a useful presentation for you. Please feel free to contact me if you need any more information about the program, and I look forward to helping you and interacting you in any which way I can over the next couple of years. Take care. Thanks.